Here's what we'll be making today. A knitted bracelet using the tools you see in front of you, which are worsted weight yarn, bulky will also work, a variegated one like this can be fun, a yarn needle, a button, a comb from the Dollar Tree, a crochet hook, pretty much any size that will hold the yarn is okay, it doesn't have to be specific, any loom hook, and a pair of scissors. Both edges will turn out alike with a nice column of chain stitch looking stitches up the edges because we'll be using a technique that automatically produces that, not tricky at all. This is a quick enough project that you can have a party and everybody can succeed in making one. People seem to enjoy the idea of comb knitting, but sometimes they wonder where they can get a comb similar to the wide-toothed one that I used in the other videos. And admittedly, that comb is really old and I don't know where you get one exactly like it now. So I went to the Dollar Tree. The weight is here just to help me stay positioned correctly and lean the comb on something. This came in a packet of several combs from the Dollar Tree. And you could knit on this side too. But today we will knit on this side. And this ruler here is just to help you picture how large it is. Let me turn it so the inches are showing. That's a 6-inch ruler. So this is about an 8-inch long comb. But the part that we are actually working on is more like 4 inches. So the way that we're going to cast on today is I started with one loop knotted in the yarn, sized to fit over a tine. 2 wraps. Make sure that the flat part of the wrap is in the front. There is a crossover and it needs to be in the back, not in the front. Bottom loop over top loop. Slide down and pull gently, not very tightly. The compromise is between the next stitch being easy to knit over and the present stitch being secure on the tine. And I thought this comb was excellent because those little curvy cutouts are very helpful to us. Over and snug up just a little bit. Over and snug up. Now from this point on, every time we move from the right side to the left side, we will do this. 1 wrap, 2 wraps, 3 wraps. And in each case, lift the bottom loop over the top loop. You see that on the tines nearby, there's a tendency for the stitches to rise up. You can control that somewhat with the finger that stays in the back. Now note, we did not knit on this stitch. That is not an accident. It's called slipping the first stitch. And we're going to do it on this end too. But moving left to right, we will make a purl stitch, lift it up, over, and place the loop that I pulled up from the bottom on the tine. Here it is again. Slide the tool behind the existing stitch, pull up a loop, lift the existing stitch off, and place the new stitch on the tine. You only have to do 2 purl stitches. The last stitch in the left to right rows is an E-wrapped knit stitch, just like the ones moving the other direction. Now, 1, 2, 3. You can do these one at a time if you want. I like to do all 3, then knit the last one over, and to my mind that makes it a little bit easier to handle the next couple. So we continue like that basically for as long as we want. My work is growing. You can see it down there coming down below the comb. Let's review purl stitches again. The working yarn goes below the existing stitch. We reach down and pull up a loop. You can do it like this too. I've prepared 2 loops, holding them with my thumb, making sure that I make the straight part of the next knit stitch go in front of the peg, lift over. Now that's anchored, and I can lift off these 2 stitches, 1 and replace, 2 and replace. You don't have to do it that way. The effect is identical to the other way. Some people find it a little bit faster. Wrap, wrap, wrap. Bottom loop over top loop. Now something just happened to me because I'm trying to work behind the camera. And it could happen to you, so I'm just going to show you how to fix it if it does. I just rewrapped the loop that popped off. Now I have 1 more to rewrap. And now I can knit it over. No big disaster has occurred. Now, in case you wonder if this is real knitting or cheating, it's real knitting. The choice of tool does not affect the facts of the matter. Let's review the stitches. This is a knit stitch. I'm going to do them one at a time this time. And it's actually most equivalent in needle knitting to a twisted knit stitch. In loom knitting, it's known as the E-wrapped stitch, but it is really a knit stitch. Okay, the next thing that we're doing by skipping this first stitch, that's a legitimate knitting technique known as slipping the first stitch. Now when we bring the yarn in front and pull up a loop from below, that causes the stitch to form backwards from what we were previously doing. And that's what makes it a purl stitch. Up and replace the new stitch on the peg or the tine. People tend to get purl stitches a little larger than knit stitches, but it's easily adjusted right now by how much tension you allow in the yarn. Now the fact that we end this row with a knit stitch, even though it was a purl row, is what's going to create an attractive edge. That means this stitch is always knitted and this stitch is always knitted. This one is knitted at the end of a left to right row, which was slip, purl, purl, knit. The other one is knitted at the end of a right to left row, which is slip, knit, knit, knit. So both edge stitches are knit stitches, and that produces this nice chained edge. Now the fact that we're alternating rows of knit and purl stitches is called garter stitch. In every kind of knitting that is true. And garter stitch, because it goes formed from one side and then formed from the other side, does not roll. Stockinette is all knit stitches, and it does roll. Famously, and you have to do quite a lot to make it stop. So for our bracelet, we wanted a fabric that would stay flat on its own, and you see that is what we're getting. I only require a couple more rows to get to the length that will fit me, so let's do this again. Take another opportunity to review the stitch. Pulling up from the bottom makes it a purl. Every new stitch gets placed onto the tine and slid down. Pull up from the bottom, remove the old stitch without dropping anything, replace the new stitch, and a knit stitch, wrapping so that the straight part comes across the front of the tine or tooth of the comb. And for the trip back, slip the first tooth, wrap and knit the other 3, up and over, and again, and one more time. The next part's easy. I'm leaving myself about 18 inches of yarn from the comb, and I'm going to snip. Now a big yarn needle, plastic or steel, it doesn't matter. Thread our yarn tail into it. And what we want to do is pick up each one of these loops. Oops, got my yarn wrapped around. Onto the yarn needle. We can do it like this. Or honestly, you can drop them all off and catch them without mishap most of the time. Pull through. Stitch through one more time. And make a knot. Now here's why I left that lengthy yarn tail. I'm going to push through the fabric behind the gathered end and pull up a loop with my crochet hook and crochet a little chain. This will be a button loop. And the length you make the chain depends on the size of button. Kind of checking it there for the length. Let me lay out some buttons and we'll decide which one. All of the buttons that I've selected to try have what is called a shank on them. This part that sticks up and makes a bump. You do not have to use that kind, but it does make it easier to sew them on and also easier to work your button loop over the button with the other hand. Let's see how each of these would look. That's sort of classic. Fancy, but heavier. And shinier, but tinier. I could go with any of them, but I think I'm going to try this one. And with this one as the choice, it looks like I've got enough of a button loop now. So once I'm sure of that, I pull my yarn tail through, and that's a knot. It can't untie. Threaded the remainder of the yarn tail back into the yarn needle, which I'm going to push through the fabric at the same place my button loop started. Closing the loop. Stitch a time or two and make sure it's strong enough. And then knot it and weave in the yarn tail. Knotting goes like this. It's a stitch with the needle pushed back through the stitch and pulled tight. You do want to get your tail pulled out. And then you use the needle to go in and out of some stitches. Pull the tail through. And snip off the tail. Now the yarn needle I have won't fit through this hole, so I'm going to see if I can work it through by another method. Ta-da! It helps to dampen and twist the end before you go through. Now I can thread these ends back into the yarn needle and get that button sewn on. If the needle had fit through the shank, okay. we could sew it on pretty much like an ordinary button. However, you need to be aware that stitches will pull right through knitting. Even the button would. See what's happening there? So I have to stop that from happening. Let me start with my button on top of the fabric, go down through one stitch, and up through a different stitch. This is the initial yarn tail from when we cast on, and we'll deal with that in a minute. But that's the down and up through a different stitch. Down again, and now we should be able to knot the yarn around stitches in the back of the work. Which is more or less, oops, I accidentally went through the shank, only I can't because the needle doesn't fit. This is what I meant to do. And now they're basically knotted, but I want it stronger. So I'm going to split the tails off from each other. Put one of them back in to the needle. Aha! And now a traditional square knot will be adequate. Left over right, right over left. Now we need to thread each of these tails one at a time into the yarn needle and weave them in. Here goes the first one. Let's thread up the second one. And in it goes. And the third one. Now if I want them to be extra secure, here comes a little trick. And I do tend to think it rather wise because on your wrist, a bracelet gets a bit of abrasion. And this will be the underside, it won't show. You don't want to restrict the lengthwise stretch, so stretch it first. And then in position, knot two of the tails together, knot the other two. And now I should be able to trim them all off without ever fearing a disaster. Now that I see the work completed, I spot an improvement that I'm going to suggest, and I can do it after the fact, but you may want to do it before sewing this button on. If I work the yarn needle, carrying a little piece of yarn, through all the end stitches, and gather them together, both ends will be more alike. Both will come to a point, or a rounded point anyway, and the button will seem to be a more graceful join between them, in my opinion. So I'm just going to gather them together, do that. And here's another trick about weaving in. If you don't have a lot of yarn tail to work with, and the length of the needle will not allow you to hold up the needle and thread it in the normal way, you can do the working in first, coming up backwards, as I am now. Insert the tails at this end and pull through. Snip, snip. And there it is.